Hello and welcome. I am Ramesh Ramachandran and you're watching a special broadcast here on DD India. Over the next 30 minutes, we will bring you up to date on what to expect from this year's United Nations General Assembly, India's contributions to the UN system over the decades, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi's interventions at the UN. So sit back and join me as I take a deep dive into what we're calling India and the UN yesterday, today, and tomorrow. It's an interesting time to speak about the UN and India. Why, you might wonder? Because this year, India is a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. India has been elected for a 2-year term, which ends on 31st December 2022. It's the 8th time India is on the UN Security Council. That's not all. The year gone by, that is 2020, marked the 75th anniversary of the UN and its founding charter. And the year to come, that's 2022, will mark the 75th anniversary of India's independence. Now, the theme of the UNGA this year is building resilience through hope. Now, as is the practice, all the 193 members of the UN elect a UNGA president every year. Maldives Foreign Minister Abdullah Shahid is the UNGA president this year. He ran his campaign on the promise of presidency of hope. He is the first Maldivian leader to become the UNGA president, and I spoke to him a few months ago. Take a listen.
It is of my view that this is a time when world leaders should get together and lift the population and give people hope.
Now, 2020 was a watershed year because of the COVID-19 pandemic. For the first time in a 75-year history of the United Nations, the UNGA was a virtual affair. World leaders submitted pre-recorded video statements for the 75th session of UNGA in 2020. And 2021 is different, but only slightly. The 76th session of UNGA this year is a hybrid event. Now, world leaders have the option of either delivering the address in person or doing with pre-recorded video statements like last year. Now, Prime Minister Modi is among the 100-odd world leaders attending the UNGA in person. In fact, it's his first visit to the UNGA in 2 years. Now, Prime Minister Modi delivers his address to the UN General Assembly on 25th September. He is the first speaker on the list shared by the UN. His address will likely be at about 6:30 p.m. India time, that is 9 a.m. local time in New York City. And DD India will be broadcasting the speech live. We hope you can make time to join us. And on a programming note, watch our continuing coverage of the Prime Minister's engagements at the UNGA, and on the margins of it, live and exclusive on DD India, complete with in-depth reports and incisive analyses. Just to give you some perspective now, it's the 5th time Prime Minister Modi is addressing the UNGA. The first was in 2014, the year he was elected as a Prime Minister. He addressed the UNGA for a second time in 2015. His third address was in 2019 and the fourth in 2020. Now, if you're wondering who attended the UNGA in 2016, 2017 and 2018, well, it was the then Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj. She passed away in 2019. Right, I want to take you back to September 2014 when Prime Minister Modi delivered his first address to the UNGA. There were two broad themes in his speech. One, UN reform, and two, combating terrorism. Take a listen.
We need to think about it. What are the reasons that it's having such a big and good platform like UN, even then, we have been making so many different G organizations. We talk about different Gs today, and their numbers keep changing. Sometimes it is G4 or G7, G20, We keep changing those. And whether we like it or not, we are also part of that. India too. But isn't it time that we move forward from G and move towards G4 to bring improvements and changes in the United Nations Security Council and make it more democratic and participatory is important for us. In our own area, in our own region, we are still struggling to fight against terrorism and instability. For the last 4 decades, we have been facing this problem, this danger. Terrorism emerges as in the different new forms and different new names. Whether small or big, whether in north or in south, east or in west, no country is free from its danger. I remember when 20 years ago, I used to meet some world leaders and I used to talk about terrorism. They would not quite understand this, and they said this is a law and order problem. But today, slowly, the entire world is witnessing that how terrorism is spreading all over. But are we really making integrated efforts at international level to fight against these powers? And I know this is a very serious problem, a serious question. Even today, some countries are giving refuge to the international terrorists, and they consider terrorism to be a tool of their policy. Good terrorism and bad terrorism. This is what we hear these days.
I want to pause here and talk a bit about the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism. What is this convention all about? Why is it needed, and whose idea was it? Well, the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism was proposed by India. Do you know when? In 1996, a full 5 years before the 11th September 2001 terror attacks in New York City. It's been 25 years and counting since then, but the UN is nowhere close to a conclusion. Consequently, the world is not able to develop a norm under which terrorists shall be prosecuted or extradited. What's more, till today, that draft has remained a draft. Why? Because the world cannot agree on a common language. On the one hand, countries say they want to fight terrorism. On the other, they cannot seem to define it. So even as we speak, terrorists with a bounty on the head are celebrated, financed, and armed as liberation heroes by some countries in India's neighborhood. The world needs closure on this count today more than ever. Already, certain terrorists have come to occupy positions of power in Afghanistan, aided and abetted by Pakistan, of course. The question is, how long will the world quibble over semantics? We know a terrorist when we see one, but cannot define it. We've seen terror attacks the world over, in India, the US, and elsewhere, but cannot come to an understanding on what constitutes terrorism. Really? The second time Prime Minister Modi addressed the UN, as I said before, was in 2015. The occasion was the UN Sustainable Development Summit, which adopted the post-2015 development agenda and 17 SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. He addressed the UNGA for a third time in 2019. That was the year he won re-election. It was also the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. Once again, Prime Minister Modi spoke out against terrorism. Take a listen.
हमारी आवाज में आतंक के खिलाफ दुनिया को सतर्क करने की गंभीरता भी है और आक्रोश भी। हम मानते हैं कि ये किसी एक देश की नहीं बल्कि पूरी दुनिया की और मानवता की सबसे बड़ी चुनौतियों में से एक है। आतंक के नाम पर बटी हुई दुनिया उन सिद्धांतों को ठेस पहुंचाती है जिनके आधार पर यूएन का जन्म हुआ है, और इसलिए मानवता की खातिर आतंक के खिलाफ पूरे विश्व का एकमत होना, एकजुट होना मैं अनिवार्य समझता हूं।
If terrorism was a focus in 2019, the year 2020 saw India push for reformed multilateralism. Now, Prime Minister Modi spoke about India's quest for a permanent membership of the UN Security Council.
आखिर कब तक भारत को संयुक्त राष्ट्र के डिसीजन मेकिंग स्ट्रक्चर से अलग रखा जाएगा? अध्यक्ष महोदय, जब हम मजबूत थे तो दुनिया को कभी सताया नहीं। जब हम मजबूर थे तो दुनिया पर कभी बोझ नहीं बने। अध्यक्ष महोदय, जिस देश में हो रहे परिवर्तनों का प्रभाव दुनिया के बहुत बड़े हिस्से पर पड़ता है, उस देश को आखिर कब तक इंतजार करना पड़ेगा?
India believes that UN reform must extend to the UN Security Council too. The Council must reflect contemporary realities to become more effective. Remember, India is a member of the Group of Four, a group of countries that seeks a permanent seat on the Security Council and advocates reform of the UNSC. The G4 comprises India, Japan, Germany, and Brazil. So this year too, one can expect India to stay on message and focus the world's attention on issues such as UN reform, terrorism, expansionism, adherence to a rule-based order, climate change, pandemic, and Afghanistan. Some other equally important agenda items for the UN are food security and rebooting the global economy. The UNGA is not about speeches only. A number of conferences take place on the margins of it as well, such as SDG Moment, focusing on the 2030 Development Agenda. Now, 6 years ago, the world adopted 17 SDGs. This year, the South Korean boy band BTS is among the special invitees to the meeting. Then there is the Food Systems Summit. Did you know that 811 million people do not have enough food to eat? Beating hunger is a priority for the world today. The production, distribution, and consumption of food is a key focus of discussions, as is making food affordable for more people. There's also the UNSC debate on environment and climate change. The UN is calling a climate emergency. And now, last year, 30 million people were displaced due to environmental causes. 90% of refugees are from countries that are most vulnerable to climate change. The UN wants countries to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius and achieve net zero emission by the year 2050. For the first time in 40 years, the UNGA holds a high-level meeting on energy. Did you know that 759 million people do not have access to electricity? That 2.6 billion people do without proper fuel? And finally, there's the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which seeks to tackle racism, discrimination, and intolerance. Now, India has had a long association with the United Nations. Now, India was among the original members of the UN that signed the declaration by United Nations at Washington, D.C. on 1st January 1942. India also took part in the UN Conference on International Organization at San Francisco from 25th April to 26th June 1945. So, in case you missed it, India was in the thick of action even before it achieved independence. I want you to watch a special video that should give you a flavor, a sense of India's association with the UN over the decades. Take a look.
India's journey with the United Nations is quite a remarkable one. As a founding member of the United Nations, India's contribution to implementing the goals of the United Nations Charter and to the evolution of UN specialized agencies and programs has been substantial, in many ways quite extraordinary.
India was among the select members of the United Nations that signed the declaration at Washington, D.C. on the 1st of January 1942. India participated in the historic UN Conference of International Organization at San Francisco and signed the charter at a ceremony held at the Veterans War Memorial in San Francisco on 26 June 1945.
We have strongly supported the purposes and principles of the United Nations in the spirit of multilateralism. Independent India viewed its membership of the United Nations as an important guarantee for maintaining peace and security.
We stood at the forefront, not just in the United Nations but outside it as well, during the years of struggle against colonialism and apartheid. India was the co-sponsor of the landmark 1960 Declaration of the UN on granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples, which proclaimed the need to unconditionally end colonialism in all its forms and manifestation. India was also elected as the first chair of the UN Decolonization Committee. We were amongst the most outspoken critics of apartheid and racial discrimination in South Africa. In fact, India was the first country to raise this issue in the United Nations. We have had pioneering Indians at the United Nations. Mr. Arcot Ramaswamy Mudaliar was the first president of the United Nations Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, in 1946. Mrs. Hansa Mehta, India's delegate on the UN Human Rights Commission in 1947-48, was responsible for changing the language of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from all men are created equal to all human beings are created equal, highlighting the need for gender equality. Mrs. Lakshmi Menon, India's delegate to the Third Committee in 1948, argued forcefully in favor of non-discrimination based on sex. Mrs. Vijayalakshmi Pandit became the first woman to be elected President of the United Nations General Assembly in 1953. On international peace and security, India has a long and unparalleled history of service in UN peacekeeping, having contributed more personnel than any other country. India's long-standing service has not come without cost. India has lost more peacekeepers than any other member state. We salute them. India also has a long tradition of sending women to UN peacekeeping missions. In 2007, India became the first country to deploy an all-women contingent, the formed police unit in Liberia, where our women officers were hailed as role models.
We have been a powerful votary of South-South cooperation.
In 2017, India started the India-UN Development Partnership Fund, the first ever single country South-South cooperating initiative at the United Nations. The $100 million fund facility was started to support SDG-related projects across the developing world. In April 2018, a US $50 million Commonwealth window was created under the fund to support developing countries in the Commonwealth. Prime Minister Modi brought yoga to the United Nations in 2014, recognizing the holistic approach of yoga to health and well-being. On 11th of December 2014, the United Nations proclaimed 21st June as the International Day of Yoga. Since then, yoga is being celebrated globally with fervor and enthusiasm. On environment, India's efforts in popularizing solar energy through the International Solar Alliance was recognized in 2018 when UNEP selected Prime Minister Modi for the Champions of the Earth Award. India has also helped solarize the UN through the Gandhi Solar Park installed on the terrace of the United Nations headquarters in New York. India has partnered UN Women since its inception to address the critical issues concerning gender equality and empowerment of women in national and global context. India remains committed to the goal of a nuclear weapon-free world and complete elimination of nuclear weapons. While not being a signatory to the 1951 Convention on Refugees, India has always been a shining example of the way we have opened our hearts to millions of refugees who come to India looking for safety and sanctuary. To commemorate the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi, Prime Minister Modi hosted a high-level event on the sidelines of the 74th United Nations General Assembly in 2019.
गांधी जी भारतीय थे, लेकिन सिर्फ भारत के नहीं थे। आज ये मंच इसका जीवंत उदाहरण है।
It is a great pleasure and a great honor to be here to mark the 150th anniversary of the birth of Mahatma Gandhi, one of the giants of the 20th century, a global icon of peace and an advocate for the most vulnerable.
Truth and non-violence are the greatest force at our disposal, and Mahatma Gandhi remains even more relevant for mankind than any time before.
It is clear to us that United Nations and indeed multilateralism itself need to change to reflect contemporary realities to enable them to remain effective and credible.
Towards this, Prime Minister Modi has called for reformed multilateralism and reform of multilateral system as essential to ensure that the international system is inclusive and caters to requirements of all countries, which will in turn facilitate stronger action. We also believe that the current crisis that we face, especially in the context of COVID-19, provide the seed for new opportunities. It is in this context that External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar launched India's priorities for its candidature to the United Nations Security Council. We have called it NORMS, an acronym for New Orientation for a Reformed Multilateral System. India's priorities include new opportunities for progress, effective response to international terrorism, reforming multilateral system, comprehensive approach to international peace and security, and technology with a human touch.
India's presence in the Security Council will help bring to the world our ethos that the world is one family. Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam.
And with that, it's a wrap. But news continues here on DD India. You can catch all the latest updates on our social media, mobile and digital platforms. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.